take a minute to do my Dennis moment real quick. When I met Dennis, I was 3 months pregnant with my second kid and taking a class trying to figure out what this whole conflict resolution thing was all about anyway, and whether or not I wanted to go back to grad school to do it. And by the end of the semester, he'd convinced me that not only should I do it, but I could do it, which was probably the most important thing to have convinced me of. So quite some years later, I was shopping with prom dresses with that child that I was pregnant with last weekend, so it's been a while. So the paper that I'm presenting is actually one in a longer term project that I've been working with a colleague named Brant Horio, who's getting his PhD in computational social sciences at Mason. And I will tell you, we've been talking a lot in the last few weeks about co-authoring. And usually we talk about co-authoring with people that are interested in doing the same kind of things that we do. This is a project where I was co-authoring with someone who was smart about a whole lot of things I know absolutely nothing about. And I'm smart about things that he didn't know anything about. So he does a lot of modeling projects, and he's done a lot of modeling for industries for his career, but didn't know anything about incorporating social science. And I can't even imagine his capacity to do the kind of computer modeling he does, but could try to figure out how to bring social science into that. And so that's what this is really an example of. The reason I decided to present this is because what I'm really interested right now is thinking about what are some different tools and techniques that we as a field can start to use to learn about what's happening around us. So unlike I think everything else we've heard today, I'm going to show you made-up scenarios. So what we were actually trying to do was model what might be happening in the world, and then eventually to test data from the real world against that to see how our model replicates what's happening. Because what we then can do is experiment and try things out. So how could I change something, right? It's not ethical for me to actually do that with people engaging in conflict necessarily, depending on what I'm changing. But how could I fundamentally change something, and that might change the outcome, and I can do that in an experimental or a model space that I can't do in real life. And I can do it and try it again a different way 5 minutes later, right? And try some things out. So I will also say that trying to model, and Kevin and I had this conversation when we started it, trying to model the complexity of our social situations in any way that makes sense is an enormous project and really complicated. But I'll show you what we've done, and then happy to have comments. So let me maybe start. So what we really started, he and I started thinking about how do we do public opinion? How do people form public opinion? And how does public opinion, how is it shared in a community? So we don't all share the same opinion, right? We have some variation of that. And what we were particularly interested in is the role that track 2 actors might play in forming that opinion. So we talk a lot in the media about kind of formal actors. We think about what's happening around our dining room table and in our kind of family in very local situations, but what is the role that track 2 actors might play in influencing public opinion? And believe it or not, so you were thinking about this kind of public opinion process. So these are not simple, we all decide now and we're never going to change our mind. These are processes by which we learn and we reevaluate as we go. And we've seen bad kind of snowballs of public opinion, right? Where we get public opinion processes that lead to mass violence or to real division versus public opinion processes that might be leading people towards more pro-social or consensus basis. So we were interested in trying to figure out how some of that might work. So there is a whole literature in the modeling community, in the public opinion community, that's about thinking about how we do public opinion. So I'm going to kind of skip over probably a lot of the technical stuff, but give you some of the formal stuff. This idea of bounded confidence. So in this modeling community, it has a particular meaning. But for me, what that meaning is that I'm not as likely to listen to someone whose opinion is radically different than mine as I am to listen to someone whose opinion is just a little bit different and think, oh, maybe he's got it right, right? Then I'm more likely to pay attention in that space. And in the work that I do looking at extremist violence and terrorist groups, one of the things we've been talking about is how do we use radical nonviolent actors as interlocutors with radical violent actors, because they're probably more likely to be the ones that can reach them, right, and try to bring them back into more moderation. So this idea of bounded confidence is that I have a boundary of how different someone's opinion is from mine, that I'm willing to still listen to them before I'm just going to completely dismiss them as a crackpot, right? So this is kind of built into this model. There's some other models that have done this before. So this is building out of, like I said, it's a fairly robust literature in the kind of political communication, public opinion modeling. And the idea behind this kind of modeling is these are called agent-based models. And so what we do is when we create the model, we give certain characteristics to all of the different agents in this model. So think of them as computer game players, right? The ones that you don't control, they're the ones that have an algorithm that drives what they do. So we give them a certain set of characteristics, and then we let the scenario play out. And what's different about this kind of approach is that unlike kind of a mathematical model where there's one solution, in this kind of agent-based model, there's a sense of randomness or probability, and I might have multiple solutions that might come out of it. And so it gives us a chance to try out some different approaches. So these are a couple of the models that we were looking at. One of the other things that we were interested in is the extent to which people are just stubborn and not going to change their mind anyway. So we have a certain propensity to think that my opinion is more important than anybody else's, and that has to be weighted. So we may have differences in how strongly we feel about our own opinion. So the model that we built on these other ones, but the thing that we then added was this idea that there are track 2 leaders, or there are people of influence in the community that I might listen to more than I might listen to just my neighbor. So what would that kind of look like? And so then here's the math, okay? The different variables. We have a variety of different state variables, and this is about the time that Brant usually watches my eyes roll back in my head as he tries to make sure I understand all of the equations. But so we had this variable that accounted for whether or not people were closed-minded or open-minded, how willing are they to change their opinion, and some people are just really closed-minded. So we distributed this ability to be closed-minded or open-minded kind of randomly across the population of agents that we created. This is what the interface looks like. And what's happening in the center of the screen is that that's actually a representative of opinion from the top to the bottom of kind of the range of opinion. The orange lines are where you see track 2 leaders, and I'll show you how we get there. So here's what happens when you start the model, and this is what it looks like when you actually make it play, is that based on a random process, different people's opinion are distributed across the spectrum, just all the way across from top to bottom. And the little orange dots you can see is where we put in some of the track 2 leaders, right? Because their opinion is distributed as well. And what we were kind of modeling was how people might come to consensus in the middle, or how that might be possible. The particular case we were thinking about was kind of thinking about peace agreements and how people might come to accept a peace agreement from having a wide variation of opinion. And so we assign, everybody gets assigned, and they have characteristics that we have given parameters for. Every tick of time, each little individual agent, so in most of these there's 100, but you could model it with 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, just depends on how much computer power you want to use. Each little agent looks around them and says, hey, I'm having conversations with people around me. How does their opinion differ than mine? And it does a little calculation of where people's opinions differ from it. And based on a variety of factors, it decides if it wants to shift. And it might shift its opinion just a little bit. Right? So it's not shifting to the other side. It's not a yes or no binary. It's shifting just a tiny little bit based on the conversation it's having with people around it in the modeling framework. Thanks. This is what the math looks like to make that shift work, believe it or not. Because for each time, any individual citizen is paying attention to what the track 2 leaders are saying. They're paying attention to what the community around them is saying, their fellow citizens. They also are being impacted by what's happening at kind of a track 1 level, right? Like what the government might be saying. So all those things combine into what their interaction is. Thomas is actually trying to make the math work in his head. I can see him. It's like, what is that? So once the agent has taken this all into consideration, what's happening around them, they decide if they want to shift their opinion or not. And that somewhat depends on how heavily they weight their own original opinion and how much they weight those around them. And then they make that shift. So what you see kind of visually is that they're moving either up or down in the spectrum. And over time, and so each from left to right, you're looking at time. Over time, you'll see that opinions begin to cluster in some different places, depending on what some of those starting points were. So I'm going to skip that for a second. But just to give you an idea of what some of the different looks look like. So the top model is a model that doesn't allow for there to be track 2 opinion leaders. So you actually didn't have anywhere near as much consensus forming. In the bottom model, we have interesting consensus forming at the middle. Though I will say, interestingly, I think for the kind of extremism or spoiler research that many of us do around peace processes, every single run that we have done this in, we have had some kind of spoiler group be created at one of the margins that is clearly not ever going to engage in the process. So for whatever reason, the divergent of their opinion has left some people just out of it, out of the process, who are no longer even connected to people in the process. So that's not going to shift. They don't have those connections anymore. So just these are a couple of the runs of it. So what we were trying to do is then figure out how do we calibrate this to real world scenarios, and the one that we know enough about to try to create some of these models, or one that we do, is actually the Northern Ireland peace process, because there's quite a bit of survey data about public opinion leading up to it. We're taking into account that there's different levels of political authority. So in Northern Ireland, actually, a citizen's opinion has a lot more weight than in some other communities, where kind of higher up that decision chain tends to be where people place their decision authority. So we were able to build that in a little bit and create some parameters for these different variables. And this is just one. So the way you make these different models work is you kind of start with a different random number, and that then creates all the different parameters. But this is one example of where we were allowing everybody's opinion to change. And actually, interestingly, in this example, everybody moved towards one extreme versus moving towards the middle. But all of these little dial boxes are things that we could change about the scenario if we wanted to. And so what we're working on doing is trying to take kind of opinion research results over a period of time and see if we can replicate those with the model, figure out what the right starting points are to try to have the model end with roughly where we see opinion. So just as another example of where we ended up, again, we have this kind of spoiler group that doesn't end up as part of the process that we saw in most of our results. And now we're working on trying to actually test it against real world, I don't know why I can never get that out, real world scenarios with actual opinion data, and trying to also test and see what are the factors that are most important and are making the biggest change. So yeah, I think that's the end of it, and I'm happy to, probably not with everybody in the room, but I have it up on my computer, and if you want to play and come make the model do crazy things, you're welcome to at some point during the break or later.
Thank you, Julie. Fascinating to see, although I'm sure we're all eager to see how it actually works. So now we'll turn to Thomas Flores.
So I'm going to apologize for a couple things. First of all, I'm going to stand up. I can't present when I sit down. Sorry. And the second thing is I've changed my paper twice. So the first paper I submitted when we were supposed to have this before it snowed, like in March, I was like, I don't want to present that anymore, to Karina about a week ago. And Karina's like, fine, send a new paper, which I sent to Umed last night. So apologies to Umed for me forgetting to do that. And then I changed the title again when I made the slides last night. So here's my presentation, Elites, Technocrats, Power, and Knowledge. At the beginning of our conversations in the very, very first session, Rich said something about, he made a call for us doing more about comparative historical analysis. And he said, but history's looked at as being soft. Soft was the word he used, I think, right? Soft. And I think that there's a tendency in the way we think, in a place that's supposed to be, as Sarah Cobb would say, transdisciplinary, maybe interdisciplinary in our worst moments, where we tend to think of, say, economics and political science as being hard disciplines. And we think of anthropology or history as being the proverbial soft disciplines. And then we may array the rest of them along some sort of continuum. I'm not exactly sure what that continuum would look like. I'm a political scientist who took a lot of economics, right? So I'm usually classified over in that sort of hard, right, quote unquote, rigorous area. And that's actually precisely what I'd like to talk about today. When I got started, and what I'd like to do is, this is a new project that's kind of different for me. I'm going to talk about it in 3 stages, sort of inspiration, presentation, and aspiration. And hopefully it'll become clear what I'm getting at. This research in a certain way started when I was 19. When I was 19, I took, because every freshman or sophomore at Harvard had to take Ec 10. Like a quarter of the campus, of the undergraduate campus at any one moment, was taking Economics 10. And I had a TA, and his name was Andres Antonius, which somehow I still remember, because I Googled him the other day. I asked Andres, who had done his undergrad at Harvard too, how he had come to be an Ec 10 TA. And he said he was on a full ride from the government of Mexico to study economics at Harvard. And I was like, huh, that's like not something I had expected to hear. I was 19, I didn't know anything about the world, right? And I said, that's really, really interesting. And then we talked more in office hours, and he said that he had been on the NAFTA negotiating team when he was only in his 20s. I was like, that's super interesting. And it's super interesting too if you think about the presidents of Mexico. between 1982 and 2012, the latest president of Mexico totally screws with my data. Miguel de la Madrid had an MPA from Harvard. Carlos Salinas de Gortari had an MPA and a PhD from Harvard. Cedillo had a PhD in econ from Yale. Fox had, I think, an MBA in business from Harvard. And Felipe Calderon had an MPA from Harvard as well. This guy is even now still on, or was until it broke up, on the board of Citigroup. What's really interesting about this is before 1982, or between the end of the Mexican Revolution in the early part of the 20th century and 1982, no Mexican president had attended a university outside of Mexico. So why 1982? Well, the way the Mexican presidency worked at the time, it was called the dedazo. The dedo is the word for finger. The current president would point his finger at the next president. And then that next president was a candidate to the PRI, and then that guy became president, right? And the president before de la Madrid said that we need someone to go talk to the investors. Because what was going on in 1982, right? There was a horrible debt crisis afoot, and they needed someone to go talk to the people at Citibank in New York. And so this isn't just Mexico, right? What's really interesting about this is not just about Mexico at all. Manmohan Singh in India was the first Sikh president, really, really well known, went to both Oxbridge schools and got a PhD in economics. And when he came into office, guess what he did? He neoliberalized the economy. Mario Monti, his nickname in Italian is Il Professore, the professor. Expertise in economics, he had been at the European Central Bank. He came in to institute austerity reforms in a technocratic government in the midst of the debt crisis in 2006 to 2009. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is best known, of course, for being the first woman head of state in Africa and for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Worked at Citigroup and the World Bank before she became president. Something like 95% of Liberia's debt was forgiven while she was president of Liberia. And when she campaigned for presidency, the second time she campaigned for presidency and won, she said, Ellen knows book. That was the really, really well-known slogan that she had. Ellen knows book, i.e. Ellen knows about economics, right? And so what I did is I did what the usual Michigan trained statistician does. I said this can't just be a few good anecdotes. There's got to be some real data here. And so what I did was I hired a team of RAs. Charles Martin Shields, one of our PhDs, Sarah Rose Jensen, who's still at Escart finishing her PhD, and a few others, helped us build a data set with me and my co-authors, Irfan Rudin and Gabriella Lloyd. And what we found out is that it's not just a few good stories. If you look at this graph, this solid line shows the number of people who went to a prestigious Western university. I can talk all about the definitions and so on. The data is based on 1,450 world leaders between 1946 and 2010. So just to go all the work that Sarah Rose Jensen and Charles Martin Shields did. The solid line is people who went, the heads of government who went to a Western prestigious university. The long dotted line here is those of whom who had what we call a technocratic background. They have expertise in public administration, economics, or finance. And the little dotted line here is soldiers, so people who had an experience in the military. And one of the biggest things we found out after 1982, after the advent of the global debt crisis in 1982, comparative historical analysis, Rich, right? After 1982, soldiers went from being about 30% of world leaders to being roughly 20% of world leaders. Technocrats went from somewhere around 10% up to nearly 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 leaders in the world today has a major background in finance or economics, enough so that we can notice and then code it, right? So which means, if anything, we're probably missing a lot of people who have this background. So the question is, why does this matter, right? Now at this point, we're 3 years into the project, and I'm trying, why does all of this matter? And that's the part of the presentation now. What we did was we wrote a paper, that's the paper, Umed, that you've read, about credit rating agencies. Nations do a lot of like what you can do if you want to go Google your credit score, right? Countries, sovereigns, do the same thing. It's called sovereign debt ratings. If they can't borrow from banks anymore since 1982. Sovereigns don't borrow from banks. So how do they finance debt spending? They finance it by releasing bonds. To release those bonds, they have to be approved by a credit rating agency in New York City. That's it. So they submit, and the word submit is really interesting in this context, they submit to be rated. They pay the credit rating agency to rate their debt. And then they get these, you've heard of these kind of things before, a AAA rating, an AA rating, an AA plus, AA minus. There are all these grades to the ratings. The United States' rating was placed on a watch during one of the one of the brinkmanship crises between Congress and the Obama administration at some point. And it was big news. And so what we decided is that we wanted to analyze when credit rating agencies essentially give upgrades and downgrades to countries' credit ratings. And our argument is that credit rating agencies in New York City like certain sorts of leaders. They like educational elites, one of the lines I showed you, because they think of them as being competent. They think of them as having the correct credentials to be the leader of a country. And we'll show you a little bit of more about this later. They think of them as having the right class background and social networks, right? They've been to the same cocktail parties. I mean that literally. They've been to the same cocktail parties as the people who rate debt in New York City. And they like technocrats. They like people who have this expertise in economics and finance. Again, there's a perception of competence. They know the most important things that have to be done for the economy. And they're ideologically neoliberal. It's a nice signal. If you have this sort of leader, there's not going to be any sort of crazy stuff with the economy. And that means that the government is going to be both more capable and more willing to pay back its debts, which is why the credit rating agencies are reviewing the country's finances in the first place. And when we did, now there's a lot of statistical mumbo jumbo that I'm happy to talk about forever after in Q&A. But what we found out in short is that it's true. Credit rating agencies in New York City give upgrades to countries led by technocrats and educational elites. And this is incredibly true of poor democratic countries. It's less true of rich democratic countries, and it's even less true of autocratic countries, right? But poor democratic countries that manage to elect technocrats and educational elites get a credit rating upgrade, or much more likely, to get a credit rating upgrade. And the upgrades oftentimes happen before the leader's done a damn thing. They happen in the leader's first year. So leader gets into power, has barely passed any legislation, and here comes an upgrade on the country's credit. And the other interesting thing is that it's not business people. It's technocrats. It's people who have this expertise in finance and economics. A great example is President Trump, who went to Wharton, right, at the University of Pennsylvania. He would get counted as a technocrat or as an educational elite in our data set. So the question is why? What we found out in our data is that technocrats and educational elites are more likely to come from affluent families, and they are more likely to come from right-of-center parties. So, okay, so now aspiration. So where am I taking all this? Because so far, I'm literally four years into this project, and I have produced one paper from it. And it's not even at a journal yet. So the question is, like, where's all this going? There's an interesting quote from The Economist. And in this, I'm thinking a little bit, now, Solon, of a comment you made earlier. And Solon, you said, if you scratch at people who say that they're just here, they're not about the normative stuff, they have normative leanings. And it's exactly the issue of technocracy that I'm interested in, because I think this is precisely the sort of thing you're talking about. There's a quote in The Economist that technocracy's greatest vulnerability, however, is its fundamental premise that complex decisions should be made free of political influence. And what I'm interested in studying is the role of technocracy as an ideological, ideational, normative way of thinking. Sorry, my phone's ringing. A way of thinking about how economics and how economic policy making should work. I think that technocracy is a foundation of neoliberalism. There's a reason why all these guys came to power in 1982. There's a reason. It was during the Reagan-Thatcher years. It was right after the Latin American debt crisis. It was right before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But their wishes tend to clash inexorably with popular wishes. And we have a mountain of research that says precisely this. James Ferguson on development, Severin Althusser on peacebuilding, Pamina's work on peacebuilding suggest that the people doing the top-down stuff disagree wholeheartedly with the people doing the bottom-up stuff. And so the question that I like to ask on the development side is, how does that happen? I'm going to use Washington, D.C. as my field site to sort of turn the flashlight around and try to understand the beliefs of this epistemic community of technocrats, how they think about how social change happens. And that's that.
Thank you, Thomas. A lot of firepower being deployed here today so far on these two papers. So let's turn to Douglas Irving-Erickson on the verdict of sexual violence and war crimes prosecutions in Cambodia and the IAC.
Cool. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us at 2:20 in the afternoon. To continue in the spirit of stories of Dennis, I think I only met him and had a conversation with him maybe 3 times. And each time it felt like he had known me for 2 decades with how his focus and his energy. And so I just, that left an impression on me. So I'm really thankful to be here for the first annual Dennis Sandole Conference. So my paper is going to be published in Human Rights Quarterly in a few days, hopefully. So I have extra copies if anybody wants them. You got like 2 days maybe to give me suggestions on feedback. But I don't really want to read this paper or talk too much about it. I'm going to give you sort of a portrait of where this fits into the research I'm doing, and then some major takeaways. So the third book that I'm going to do is really going to be around these questions of justice and the meaning of justice in international criminal processes, and then the role of, and then actually viewing the international tribunals as continuations of conflicts, especially when you begin to look at the structural drivers of conflicts. What do I mean by that? Well, there's an overarching pattern, which is that usually international criminal courts are the term limits and the statute of limitations are very, very carefully crafted to prevent any exploration of the larger structural drivers of conflict from making its way into the criminal court records. So we see this in the Cambodian tribunals, for instance, where China and the US blocked any sort of move for the courts to consider before the Khmer Rouge take Phnom Penh, and then after the Khmer Rouge are driven out of Phnom Penh. And the reason is because before opens up US complicity in war crimes and the war crime of plunder and all sorts of horrible atrocities. And then after, China and the US were the largest supporters of the Khmer Rouge all the way up until the 90s. So what we find here is that this process where the justice mechanisms actually are used to silence certain narratives of what's happening in conflicts. So this paper that I'm doing, this really comes out of this really represents 2 areas of some articles that I've been publishing on. The first area is that I've been looking at in a lot of criminal prosecutions is the role of hunger and the way that famine and starvation is excluded systematically from international criminal law. And I trace this to the 1920s and 1930s. And the other one is sexual violence and sexual crimes excluded. And both of these are really fascinating because one of the things that there's been a lot of good research on local indicators of justice around the world. I don't have to conduct any of that. But sexual violence and hunger keep coming up as incredibly potent demands for justice, right? People want justice for these things. And those two were famine and sexual violence really were things that were purposefully excluded from international treaties that created criminal law. So in Cambodia, what we find here is this paper itself is looking at sexual violence prosecutions in Cambodia. And one of the things that, I sort of present a little backdrop here, is that the International Chambers and the Courts of Cambodia, the ECCC, it's a hybrid tribunal, a UN-backed tribunal, which is 50, all the decision-making points, there has to be 51% of the decision-making body has to be Cambodian, and then the 49% are international judges. So that means, for instance, that there's a split of Cambodian judges and Western judges. And then the other part of this is it comes out of the French legal system. So you have pre-investigating judges, you have all sorts of appeals put in place into the court, but you also have civil party participation. So the criminal courts that exist in an English-speaking tradition, you just have two parties, the prosecution and defense. And of course, the French civil law tradition has three parties in a tribunal, civil parties. Now, this first case that I write about, one of the things that is really fascinating is that the pretrial chamber judges ruled that sexual violence could not be prosecuted in the tribunal because the people on trial were the leaders of the Khmer Rouge state, had passed laws in the domestic legislation outlawing rape and sexual crimes. So therefore, they took this as an indication that the leaders of the Khmer Rouge had intended to stop rape and stop sexual violence. And therefore, any sexual violence or rape that occurred within the context of the genocide was therefore not their criminal liability, but happened because it occurred incidentally within the context of a conflict. And this is a very fascinating ruling for many reasons, which I talk about. But the one that I want to point to right here in this is that they didn't do the same thing for murder, right? Because the Khmer Rouge had also outlawed murder. And of course, they ended up murdering half the population of the country. So it's this question there, why in murder do we allow this to occur, but sexual violence we don't? Now, I published an article last year where I did this with the ICC and sexual violence prosecutions, which is that when it comes to killing and all sorts of other war crimes, the ICC allows for all sorts of levels of evidence that are hearsay evidence, really low standards. But when it comes to sexual violence, all of a sudden the standards go up for what counts as evidence. So one of the arguments I'm trying to make here is that actually to understand the failure of international criminal law to deal with sexual violence means that we have to understand it as not as a deficiency in the law, but rather within biases and traditions of bias within the law and what we consider serious and so forth. Part of what I'm dealing with in this paper is this really interesting phenomenon where the 5 minutes, yeah. Is that one of the sort of the complexities that emerges then is that not only do we have these questions about the double standards of sexual violence, match this with the fact that demands for sexual violence are really what are driving civil party, demands for justice after sexual violence are really driving civil party participation. But then you add into this that strange thing where they're looking at the criminal code of the Cambodian government, of the Khmer Rouge regime, and using that as evidence of the court's, of the regime's intention not to commit mass sexual violence. So within that, what you have is this process, which is another thing that I want to write about later, is that the categories of which that define mass systems of mass violence usually become the categories by which we think about mass violence later. And in this way, what happens is a strange effect where international criminal justice mechanisms actually begin to recreate the worldview of the perpetrators themselves. So in the Cambodian legal, in the Khmer Rouge law, it was not a crime to kill somebody who was a bad element. It was not a crime to rape them. Because a bad element of society was somebody that was not deserving of rights within the revolutionary government. And therefore themselves, it was not a crime. You could, if you killed them, that's not murder, right? Because they're not humans. And that odd way that notion of that category gets transposed into international criminal law is actually a really fascinating puzzle when it comes to justice. Now, all of this sort of comes back with these questions of one of the things that when you listen to local demands for justice, and this is something that I've done lots of evaluations in Cambodia, is that people begin to say what they think justice means, but that's a different question than when you ask them, what do you want to prosecute? So what do you want for justice? People say hospitals and schools and reconciliation and don't spend millions of dollars doing this, spend it building infrastructure, health infrastructure. When you say, what do you want to prosecute? All of a sudden, that question begins by saying, well, we want to prosecute the CIA and KGB involvement in Cambodia, right? And there's a drive where these kinds of narratives ends up being silenced, right? International lawyers look at that and scoff and roll their eyes. Well, that's not a serious claim. Cambodians want to do things like, they say, what do you want to prosecute? Well, one of the things that you want to prosecute is the manipulation of foreign aid, right, which is happening after the Camp members. And then Western audiences sort of scoff and roll their eyes. And finally, of course, the point of this paper is that sexual violence is one of the things that they want to prosecute, right? And it's one of these things that ends up evaporating. So that's my 10 minutes. And I just want to say that I think in this way, I think we have to think of, I got 2 minutes left. Ah, look at that. I got it. Cool. I can relax, right? Yes.
I told you 10 so I could have more time.
Yeah. I can relax. Look at that. So one of the things that really emerges then is that these international criminal justice mechanisms, this in Cambodia and in lots of other cases around the world, they are anchors for local peace processes. So the person I studied with at Rutgers has just written a book called The Justice Facade. And his point is that most of the development aid for local peace building work, for community dialogues, for working on violence or school or education, one of the code words that you have to slip into your applications for funding is the courts, right? And justice and local justice. So the courts themselves become this anchor for this whole NGO industry, right? And I think what's interesting here is the way that that's recreating certain conflict dynamics that people on the ground in societies are viewing as actually, I got 45 seconds left, right? This is wonderful, right? Rambling time. But in the last 30 seconds, I want to really conclude by saying that I don't think we should think of these justice processes being somehow external to the conflicts and promoting reconciliation. But actually, when you start thinking in structural terms, they're feedback loops, actually, to a lot of the things that people think are wrong with their own societies. And they delegitimize voices as being crazy when it comes and says things that the international lawyers don't like. So that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Douglas. So now we'll turn it over to our discussant, Umed Partov.
Thank you so much for this remarkable scholarly works. I would like to say a couple words about Dr. Sandole. He was a phenomenal person, very charismatic, very down-to-earth person. He will remain a role model for most of us here at ESCAR. And he was one of the reasons I chose to come to ESCAR, actually. We will miss him a lot. So I'm sure many of you came here to this specific session to understand, to improve your understanding about the social processes. And hopefully you will not leave this room confused. This is, social processes is a very complex, from all the presentations and all the things that were mentioned here, I think this could be boiled down to one thing, that in social process, people, human beings, play a critical role, the central role. And if we, if I could use this metaphor, if we think social process as a human body, I would equate people as its heart. Some of you might not agree with me, especially our colleagues in IR, but people matter. So I just want to bring a quote from Rumi, he's a 13th century poet. He says that grief can be the garden of compassion if you keep your heart open through everything. Your pain can become your greatest ally in your life's search for love and wisdom. So I truly believe whatever we do in the field of conflict analysis and resolution is about people, is about human beings. The work that was done by Dr. Shed is very important for the field, especially in terms of quantifying the effectiveness of multi-track diplomacy. I think it's very important when we talk with practitioners, with policymakers who are all about data. This paper provides a model that can help us express things in numbers for the technocrats. And also, what is important about this paper is we can also identify the types of interventions and what could be, where we could put resources. So I have one comment regarding this paper. I don't know, maybe you felt this as well. I was a little bit uncomfortable in terms of defining agents as close-minded, moderate, and then open-minded. People have different drives during the conflict moments. So I don't know, while working on this, have you thought about, putting a different label maybe? So with regards to Dr. Flores' paper, it's very important, specifically because it's providing us with a different dimension of looking how the development at the global level takes place, especially in terms of channeling funds to developing countries. The only thing I'm afraid of, I hope countries will not start sending their people to Harvard now, knowing that they might get more funding from IMF or World Bank. My question to Dr. Flores is that I know in your paper you were focusing on private CRAs, the private sector. Do you think the same? You might find the same patterns in the way IMF and World Bank does their business. They're one of the biggest funders. I did a little bit of research. IDA, the International Development Association, has, since 1960s, it has invested $350 billion in developing countries. So it would be interesting to see, what are the, we know there are some data about the formal way of allocating funds, but informally what's behind the scenes. The third panelist, Dr. Erickson, again, as I said, while trying to understand the social processes, you again touched upon the relationship between state, civil society, and ordinary people. So there are obviously tensions, especially where if there is an authoritarian regime. Again, it is about the people, and the governments. What they try to do is to service their people, and they try to make sure they perform those services that are expected from the government. In Cambodia, what would you say, how much the civil society is effective in terms of working with the government to make changes in existing laws? Yeah, thank you.
Do you want us to respond first?
Do you want to collect more questions, or you want to?
What do you guys want to do?
I'm different.
Well, why don't you play off that, and then we'll go to the audience.
Well, I can start, and Umed, I'm glad that you actually were able to get through and have coherence enough to create questions, because I think one of the challenges about this is this kind of work is so different from the kind of descriptive work that we're used to doing that it's kind of difficult to figure out how to enter into engaging with it. So I have a flip answer to your question, which is the nice thing about working with fake agents in a computer is I can call them whatever I want to, right? They won't be offended. Yeah.
Until they take over.
Yeah, exactly. until AI takes over. No, but it actually, I think this is an interesting question in that if we're ascribing traits to something. There is a different sensibility to working, and in some ways it's a freeing sensibility to working with people that are not real people. Like we can try a lot of different things and ascribe very radical positions versus we can do some unrealistic things in terms of what their traits and characteristics are, or we can try to model more realistic things. I do think that one of the real challenges is then how do we translate? We clearly aren't going to walk up to a policymaker and say, I think if you have a closed-minded population, here's where you need to place your track to, figures, right? So I think there is a question about what might make sense from a technical language in terms of describing what we're trying to allow the models to do, which is a really good shorthand for what we're trying to do. Clearly needs a different level of translation if we actually go into a policy conversation. And in translation in a whole variety of ways. I think the outputs of the models are not going to be satisfactory for someone. They're going to look at that and say, I have no idea what you want me to do with it, right? So thinking about how do we do the kind of testing or experimental testing that gets the kind of results that you can then say, okay, we do have some what if statements. Like if you do this kind of thing, here's what we're seeing happen in the model. And that's not the stage that we're at yet, but I think that translation piece is really important.
Thanks, Umed, for those really smart comments. I would. So the quick answer to your question is yes. The IMF is more likely, and there's been other people, before us started to show this, and we have a working paper that we haven't sent out yet that shows it as well. The IMF is more likely to lend to countries that have cabinets full of technocrats. And remember, our work is only at the leader level, and in part because it's just really hard to find out who the Minister of Finance and the central bank head were of Nigeria in 1975. This is a remarkably difficult thing to do, actually. We had enough trouble with this. So at the cabinet level, what we've shown with heads of government government is that the IMF is more likely to lend to countries that are led by technocrats. I would caution one way though. The flows of money we're talking about in the private sector and how those are affected by rating agencies like Fitch or S&P or Moody's is an order of magnitude more than $350 billion, right? The Ukraine, as of a couple years ago, is spending nearly 20% of its budget servicing its private sector debt. 20% of its budget, right? $1 in every $5. So the amount of funds we're talking about private sector are actually gigantic. They actually dwarf, official, ODA and World Bank and IMF structural adjustment loans, stuff like that. It's not to say that those aren't important, because they are. It's just to say that the private sector flows of money are just much larger.
So this question about the state, civil society, and ordinary people. First,
By the way, IR doesn't care about at all.
Oh yeah, no, it's no, that's right. Yeah, there's well, first of all, I commend you for slogging through this, because HRQ is a law journal. And when I saw the edits that they wanted me to make, I didn't recognize my article anymore. So it was like, things like you have 3 clauses in this sentence. Which one does the footnote at the end refer to? It's like, I don't know, I just stuck it there, right? So I'm a social scientist. Just put your footnote at the bottom, and right? The sentence and move on in life, right? You can appreciate that, right? So thank you for slogging through that. Cambodia is this, it's this space where I think a lot of people kind of use it to make themselves feel good, right? And I think that there's several of these. Rwanda ends up being another one like this. The NGO industry plays this perverse function, I think. And you also see this way that these spaces are created as sort of dark spaces and dangerous spaces, right? The mysterious locals who, and there's a lot of exploitation of that goes on, right? Amongst good-meaning do-gooders, in Cambodia, I need to watch what I say. It's being live streamed, but I just be honest. Why not? In Cambodia, you have a situation where between 76 and 79, it was illegal to have sexual relationships in a marriage that was not specified by the state. Which actually, if you think about it, can mean that all sexual acts that occur within the context of the marriage are rape, right? If you're having forced marriages, and then any sexual acts outside of it get classified as crimes, right? It's punishable by death to have illegal flirting. Now this produces a society where children who are born between 76 and all the way to like 80, right? Probably born to parents who were part of these state arranged marriages. And then a lot of people who stay married, right? For all these different reasons, and they're deeply personal reasons. Who am I to say you guys were forced to be married, you should have justice for this? What if you fell in love with that person, right? What if you have a shared experience of terror and trauma, and you've lived with this, and after the regime collapsed, this person was the only person who you are now living with in this total craziness of this country, right, for the next 20 years, and you raised your kids together, right? So there's all sorts of questions there about justice that never going to be satisfied by a tribunal, right? And so in a way, then justice, especially in these cases, these really big global cases, justice ends up being kind of a game, right? Justice is the game by which power politics is played, especially when actors want to control the peace process. So this is the part that, I'm very thankful I'm in a tenure track job, which is that if too many people hear me say this, I might not be able to go back to Cambodia. The ruling party in Cambodia uses this tribunal to cultivate judges who then enter into society as being considered technocratic, highly educated judges, right? So what happens when a local village has a land grab that's happening, and they go to the local court, and that court is somebody that's been hand-selected by the ruling party in the country, right? And you see this in Rwanda too, that actually these regimes use these courts to consolidate their own power and purge their enemies under this banner of international legitimacy and peace, right? And then you tie that to the development industries, and all of a sudden you have this sort of perverse dynamic. And ordinary people are sitting there trapped in all of this, right? With very, very basic demands and needs, right? And that ends up being silenced and excluded by the very institutions and mechanisms that are there ostensibly to serve them, right? And they have their own ways of fighting back, and I've been writing a little bit about this. They have resistance, they have models, but anyway, that's messy soup, yeah.
Hi, this is for Professor Thomas. Thank you for that wonderful 3-year study that I didn't know you were doing. I've always wanted somebody to do that and to bring the evidence. But here are 2 pushbacks that I want your response to. One is that it's really not a bad thing in the last 40 years, 30 years, that there are far few warriors guiding society towards perpetual states of war. Because by all accounts of survival, child survival, mass rape, mass violations, it's better to have less wars. So there is some argument to be made that technocrats are improving those numbers just by not being warriors. So I want to ask your opinion about that. And the evidence is clear that it's going down. The number of frequency of wars has gone down dramatically. But the other thing is microeconomics versus macroeconomics, in the sense that in Israel, I just got a great lecture from very enthusiastic social justice folks there's an initiative called 922, and it's a social cohesion kind of, and they have demonstrated to the government with fairly simple calculations that educating Arab Israelis to be teachers and then not hiring them is costing them $100 million over the next 20 years. And so they proved that the waste of the support for them and then not allowing just 500 adds up to $100 million. And so this shifted the government completely based on the pragmatists who were doing the finance ministry. And they put them on the social justice side, which they had never been before, despite all the racism and prejudice. So that seems to be, I thirst for our field to have a relationship between conflict resolution methodologies that are demonstrable in terms of their microeconomic benefits, and a better relationship between the numbers and what we're trying to prove in terms of incremental change. I just want to know how you react to that in terms of the whole field of economics.
Someone wants to take questions? I'm not as sure, actually, about the first question, actually. And there's been this really, really great work by Michael Horowitz and Alan Stam and one more person, I'm forgetting the third author, in a book called Why Leaders Fight. And there's an increasing interest in how leadership affects the course of conflict in international relations. And their answer is actually an interesting one. Soldiers who've seen action, who've actually fought in a war, who become leaders of their country, are less likely to get their countries into large interstate wars. Soldiers who've been in the military and never saw action are more likely than average to get they labeled this the Kaiser Wilhelm II effect. They also labeled it the George W. Bush effect. And so I actually am not sure there's an undifferentiated soldier effect on the underlying probability of war. And there are also some generational effects here, that sort of the fall off of soldiers may also be due in part to the passing on of the slow passing from the stage of the World War II generation. And so I'm not entirely sure I'm ready to go all the way there. So I'm not entirely sure I'm ready to accept the premise of that first question. And on the second question, I think you're right, and I don't have a strong. I'm going to say that I don't have a smart answer to that yet. I'll probably think of one in like 3 days, right? But what I would say is that I do understand the idea that there being possibilities of interactions at the microecon level with modes of practice that we're more familiar with here at SCAR that might be productive. What I worry about is right back to Pamina's findings, right? So I can just cite Fairchild 2018, right? That what Pamina's findings show, right, really conclusively in several cases, sorry, is that more development financing at this micro level that isn't necessarily leading to security and changes in everyday peace. And so I'm not as convinced as you are. Are there possibilities? Yes, but I'm not ready to say yes, there absolutely, and to be enthusiastic about that necessarily.
Thomas, I just wanted to welcome you to the ranks of the softies. Always reminds me of a friend in Chicago who, when I refused to join a certain party, accused me of being a hardened softie. Thomas, what interested me about that, though, here's a sort of a little of your own medicine, kind of as a critique, or rather a suggestion, which in the form of a question, of course. The analysis was fascinating, and I love the data. But when you sort of trace lots of it to the debt crisis of 1982, it made me wonder whether that crisis itself and the institutions established to deal with it, in fact, the debt credit system, isn't all linked to broader developments in the world economy. So that if you had another graph, or graphs, that measured globalization, you might, I don't know how you do that, but it might be interesting, because so much of what you said, some of what you said reminded me of, Edward Bernstein, the German social democratic leader, had a theory of ultra-imperialism. He said where the finance system is moving, because he saw, globalization starting. Where the finance system is moving is towards a kind of global cartelization, which is going to produce exactly the sort of thing that you're describing, really ruled by technocrats, responsible to international organizations, responsible to big capital. And so I'm just wondering if you can, if you're in a position at some point to go beyond the debt crisis as such an important event, you might find that part of a pattern.
I could go on forever, so I don't want to go on too long. There's a graphic in my first book that shows what we call fiscal space, and so we kind of had to wrangle data from the World Bank and kind of fight with it a little bit, and kind of if you torture the data enough, eventually they'll confess. And what we found out is that if you take taxes per capita over time, 1982 is kind of the inflection year. Taxes per capita in Latin America in real like purchase power PPP terms, or so purchase power parity terms, was actually higher than in Europe before the dawn of the debt crisis. After the dawn of the debt crisis, taxes per capita just dropped off a cliff. There are countries, in some of the poorest countries of the world, taxation per capita is at something like a couple dollars per head, which is an incredibly small amount to fund the sorts of things that we would like to fund. And that's in part precisely because of the force that you're identifying. When we talk about globalization, we think of it as this undifferentiated thing. Most taxation by most countries is done by tariffs. Tariffs were the primary source of tax revenue for most countries, because it's very, very hard to collect income tax, wealth tax, even a VAT is hard to do. And so tariffs were the easiest thing to do. If you have 1, 2, 3 ports, you're collecting the tariffs at these 1, 2, 3 places and you're done. The second that countries signed on to trade agreements and into the WTO eventually, that eliminated their ability to collect tariffs. When they stopped collecting tariffs, they stopped collecting taxes, by and large. And so I think that I'm not trying to attribute causality in this way by saying it's the technocrats that did it. What I'm saying is that they're part of a broader march. And I think at times, not everywhere, definitely not in history, sometimes an overly ignored part of that global march. That for me, 1982 is sort of a seminal year.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question goes to Dr. Flores. When you were talking about the drop from 1980 onwards, you kind of attributed to economics or the debt crisis. And I was thinking, did you consider about the international pressure during that period that were trying to force or trying to force other countries or less developed countries to move from autocracy to democracy, which could be one of the reasons. And then my other thing is, what about other factors like international support for the technocrat or the more educated people, because it's believed that they are more pro-West, and for the interest for the West, they will probably be supporting these candidates to run. Maybe that could have been accounted for the reason why there was a drop in terms of the number of people who were less educated and less technocrat in the system. Thank you.
Those are really great questions. Yes, so after 1982, the international pressure through IMF agreements and so on countries to adopt particular neoliberal packages of funding was incredibly strong. And that's part of the story. That's absolutely part of the story in the same way that Rich was asking. I think part of what we argue that all the sort of technical parts of the argument are kind of hard to get through in a short presentation is that what countries did to respond to that pressure before they could show it with policies, before they could show it with legal changes and so on, were to put the right leader in power as a kind of signal to international markets. It's a cheap way to do it. If a party who controls the state apparatus anyway can get the right leader in power, it serves as a signal. It's precisely what Mexico did in 1982. The PRI stands for Institutionalized Revolutionary Party. And in 1982, they said, well, the hell with that, right? We need to put the right leader in power to signal that we mean business, because otherwise, who are we to say? No one's going to trust us. And for them, I think before big changes could happen, the leaders were a way to signal. And I think that's an important part. That's an important part of the story. But absolutely about the international pressure. I think the other way of thinking about the international pressure is that second part of your story. I think that there's been a normative change in global politics since the 1980s, where there's a generalized expectation that these sorts of leaders will be in power. And because of the demonstration of that expectation, parties and voters respond. And I don't know if I think at this point it's expectation more than pressure, because there's this kind of broader normative change amongst a particular subset of the people who go to Davos, right, of how countries should do business.
I have a question for Julie and for Doug. Thank you, everyone, for wonderful presentations. And Julie, you showed this one opinion which is coming. I actually was thinking about Colombia and Ukraine, and where support for war or support against war actually completely polarized, right? In Colombia, referendum half voted for justice, half for peace. The same in Ukraine, if you see public opinion, and usually it's the side of the country which is affected by war or violence, they vote for peace. The side of country which are not affected by violence want justice. So how you can incorporate into your model like this interesting dynamic? And Doug, it's really interesting, you brought very interesting concept how international community actually defines which particular crimes are prosecuted and how they're prosecuted. And I'm thinking about Japan, and Imperial was not prosecuted because it didn't fit with US policy at this time. So how we can deal with this particular situation and how we can help countries to make independent decisions of what crime is?
I can start with an answer and then turn it over to Doug. I think actually that's one of the cool things about doing this kind of modeling is that we can create a lot of those starting points. So there's no reason that I couldn't start a model in which there wasn't much in the middle, and people and all of the agents in the model really were dispersed at the polls. Or in which the really important opinion leaders. So one of the things that we were looking at is that opinion leaders really changed, that having that mid-level opinion leader really changed how people coalesced around particular ideas. I could change where those are placed and see what those dynamics change. I do think that this idea of bounded confidence from a kind of theoretical level matters for our field, because usually what we do is we get people together in the same room who are from opposite sides and think that they're going to somehow sit in the same place and convince each other, and they don't, right? Like we're watching the polarization of American public discourse happen, and people are making attempts to have people sit down and they all listen to each other and then walk away and feel unsatisfied with the fact that they couldn't change anybody's mind. And so I do think from I think this is important to think about those kinds of communities where we're starting out with that kind of polarization and you don't have those bridges. And if people are only willing to engage and listen to someone else's opinion so far away from their own, what else is needed for us to bridge that? How do we start interacting with people who might be the closest to bridging and start moving them a little bit? Or so I think they're interesting cases, and I think that's actually one of the nice advantages of doing this kind of modeling is that we could set up these different kinds of scenarios and say where would I need to place the right kinds of leaders, and from a practical conflict resolution perspective, what would that mean is how do I help make leaders in those places salient? How could I go encourage the voices of leaders who are filling particular kinds of roles in the community that might create impact? So I do think there is a practical implication for this, right? That once we can think about, does the model start to reflect what we think it reflects, which is in the stage we're at right now, then we can say, how do I create scenarios that start to look like what's happening in the real world? And then think about planning intervention based on some trial and error here, not trial and error with people's lives. And what might that help us then inform the practice we would want to do? Because I think you're exactly right. Those are the kinds of scenarios that we don't have the ability to test the tools for in a way that's timely for us to make decisions.
To this question of how to help local communities determine where crimes are prosecuted, this strikes at something in me which I'm torn on, is the value of international law and justice. And I think that this is a long way to the answer, but I think universally in human history, and history there being, somebody wrote a dissertation with a historian on the committee, right? And I can claim that little, right? 1/4 of my disciplinary background. But actually I have a colleague, I think David Crow, who's a historian. He wrote a wonderful book on war crimes, prosecutions, and human history. And it's just it just goes back into all these ancient traditions and really does this comparative historical analysis. Reciprocity under the law is like this universal theme that keeps developing. So international criminal prosecutions would be great if the U.S. acknowledged reciprocity under the law, right, and was willing to engage in these things. In that case, then I think then international law is this sort of giant abstract force would be great, right, thinking about prosecutions. Without that, with no reciprocity under the law, it actually becomes a driver for the conflict. So the best cases where you had tremendous amounts of reconciliation work that happened was actually when local courts divorced themselves from international institutions. So for instance, Argentina just simply ruled that we don't need a UN-backed tribunal, and we're going to take this concept of genocide and hold our own genocide prosecutions. And this happened in the context of the Kirchner government, which was all willing to default on all their loans, right? They bankruptcy, loved it.
Public school, working class origins.
Right, no, that's right. That's right.
Never again on that.
Yeah, and there's a sense there. So you had all these regional prosecutions of international war crimes, right, in Argentina, which sparked tremendous amounts of conversations in these villages. So and in Canada is another really interesting one. Canada did the same thing with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, thinking about the boarding schools as instruments of genocide, which has provoked a tremendous amount of conversations within communities in Canada that are dealing with these things. And so in that case, unless there's going to be reciprocity under international law, then I think it's actually better to abandon the project of international law. Entirely. That's sort of what I think. And then let communities themselves, right, embark on it. So.
Well, with that fascinating idea, let's thank our panel and our discussant.
Yeah.